Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I know it's the penultimate week of the semester. I know all of you are very busy right now, and I know it's early in the morning, so for some at least. And so I'm glad to see so many of you here. Yeah, I know. Now we used to be many more, but it still is a considerable size considering the taking into account the time of the semester. So we're going to finish this unit 4. And hopefully I will have time to start Unit 5 today and cover a significant part of it. So next week, we only just have to go through the last stages of Unit 5, which is a little bit like the shortest one of the units. Anyway, in this one, Unit 4, if you remember anything from last week, we are trying to understand how historians think, how historians try to make sense of the past and so on. And I introduced this last week, but I'm going to take you from the beginning of that introduction so we can catch up and at the same time reconnect to the ideas that we did not have time to discuss last week. So, as usual, we know that we have to link whichever unit that we are studying to the previous units. And remember, our first unit had to do with notions of past and history and the differences and their connections and so on. And we're trying to make sense of what we do here is trying to understand the past. And in doing so, we create history, or we write history as something different from what the past is. And there's a strong component of interpretation, and that's something that you need to be aware of. Then problems and questions that we address in unit 2, how historians usually begin their research with a research question that leads to some sort of problem that is related to important historical concepts. And that's what you have to look for when you are looking at your essay questions and so on. What are the issues or problems that are behind the questions that are given to you? And at some point, when you are able to elaborate your own questions, it's like how to frame your own research questions. Unit 3, of course, had to do with sources. And we said the main idea about sources is that, yes, history is about interpretation of the past, but it's an interpretation that is not just opinionated. It's an interpretation in which, like, we combine facts in our analysis or our interpretation, which is based on sources. Without the use of sources, history makes little or no sense. The validity of what we say as students of the past relies on the use of sources, but not just the use of sources for the sake of it. It has to be an active use of sources in which we engage the sources from a critical perspective. We assess the validity of the sources and we interpret the meaning of the sources in relation to our historical research. And in doing that, what we try to do is ascertain the evidence that can validate our main argument or thesis statement and so on. But now reconnecting to the main idea or to the main question or the main topic in this unit, how historians and students of history think. All right. We explained last week, and I will continue explaining this today, is that in understanding the past, as you can understand, as you realize, it is not a simple task. The past is complex, not just because of the size of like the amount of events that took place, but also because of our distance, the distance between us and the past. All of that makes it complex to study. And in order to make sense, to facilitate the understanding of this complexity, historians have developed what we call is a particular type of thinking or historical thinking. And this historical thinking, as we will examine today, or as we will discuss today, is characterized by certain principles and certain concepts, some of which are listed here. Chronology, the use of chronology or timelines. We tend to think chronologically. What happens first, what happens next, and so on. There's always a sequence. And it's important because sometimes if we are trying to understand that past and those events from the past, we need to see that relationship, that sequent relationship between events and so on. So in our mind, we have to have a clear understanding of that chronology of events, the timeline of events, if you prefer. Another central idea that I will elaborate on later on is change and continuity. The notion that, yeah, change takes place in society, hence that's what we study history. But at the same time that we understand or we study the change throughout time, we also trying to explain why the continuities, why there's certain elements that tend to continue and so on. The legacies that sometimes we refer to when we talk about the past and the present. The legacies of the past in the present. That's the change in continuity. Of course, multiple causality or multiple causation, another concept that we are going to elaborate on, which has to do with the way in which like historians, they tend to explain the past on the basis of multiple causes as opposed to single causes and so on. And in understanding this multiple causality and the change in continuity, the historians also have to take into account the historical context. If we are going to understand the reasons behind certain events or actions, we need to understand the appropriate historical context. That is, historical events and the actions of the historical actors take place in a particular historical context, which is different from us. The historical context has to do with time and space. It happens in a particular place, which might be different from our place or not, but definitely takes place in a different time space or in a particular time in history, which is different from us. And that's what it makes it different. And that's what we need to keep into account when we are trying to make sense of understanding the past. And all of that is what provides us or makes it possible the historical analysis. Taking all of these and all the principles into account, the historian or the student of the past is going to try to understand or to analyze the evidence, right, and try to create some sort of argument to make sense of the past. All that historical analysis has to take into account, among other things, chronology, change in continuity, multiple causality, historical context, and so on. All of that determines the way in which historians think, right? But I'm going to elaborate on this shortly. So thinking a little bit more about this notion of historical thinking, right? We need to understand what it is and how it developed. And I say there that historical thinking and history in general, as a discipline, as an academic discipline, developed at some point in the early 19th century, right? As an academic discipline, it developed from the early 19th century. And in developing, basically, it has become more and more complex. And one of the ways in which we see the complexity, the evolving complexity of history is this notion of historical thinking. And I say over time, historians have developed a particular way to make sense of our complex past. This is what we call historical thinking or historical analysis, right? Each discipline has a particular way to analyze the kind of problems that they are concerned with. All right, so we understand that. For those who are doing history and journalism, that's also important, right? We will see that there are elements in common between journalism and history, but there are some other elements that are different, right? And that's what we have to think about it. If you're thinking also about, for example, a related subject like history and archaeology, we also see differences. The way in which the way in which we do our analysis, right? The way in which we do our analysis in history is different from the way in which like archaeologists do their analysis of the past, right? There are similarities, but there are also differences and so on. Sociology. Sometimes sociologists are also concerned with issues that we are concerned with. However, that concern doesn't mean that we understand or we analyze those problems or those issues in the same way. There are differences in the ways in which different disciplines analyze their problems, and at the same time, as I said, there are sometimes similarities, as you can easily understand. So historical thinking, it's crucial to develop historical problems and questions. The way in which we frame the questions are informed by historical thinking. That is, the kind of problems and questions that I want to solve as a historian are going to be framed differently from the way or from the kind of problems and questions that other academics will examine, right? So I might be concerned with, for example, with, I don't know, political uprising, right? And the political scientist might be also concerned with political uprising. But because I think of this from a historical perspective, the way in which I'm going to frame the problems is different, right? And one of the things that I tend to think is political uprising in a particular time context, like what is happening, what is the timing behind this political uprising, and so on. How is this political uprising evolving? That's another thing that we see. The historian has something that maybe the political scientist does not have. Can you tell me any examples of political uprising right now going on in the world?
In Hong Kong.
Hong Kong is one. Anything else? What else is happening in terms of political uprising or turmoil? Closer to home? Huh? Haiti. Okay, so we have examples in Haiti. Anything else? Well, when you checked the news yesterday, international news, did you see anything? Okay, you didn't. Who checked the international news yesterday?
US.
We see political uprising in the US.
Not.
That is happening. That's not uprising. I mean, it's a very. I don't know if you're referring to the impeachment process, but I mean that's pretty regulated and kind of like very civil. It's happening, you know. No, nothing else. How many of you remind me? How many of you were doing history and journalism? I know nobody wants to raise their hand now, but I know it's many of you, right? I mean, you are so, yeah, I'm doing history and journalism. I'm not doing history, you know. But like, show me that you're doing journalism as well. What is happening in the world? So we know something is happening in Haiti, something is happening in Hong Kong. And what about Chile? And nobody heard about Chile? What about Bolivia? Nobody heard about Bolivia? And I barely have time to look at the news, huh? You know, I barely have time. Honestly, I don't have time. I used to look at the news and read the news and listen to the news more. Like I can't remember the last time I watched TV. I mean, other than escapism, right? Which I do from time to time. Anyway, yeah. So yeah, things are happening in also in Latin America. We see examples in Bolivia. We see examples in Chile. And if you want to know what happened, you have to ask me, right? No, you can go online and do it yourself. Some of these, by the way, some of these issues or some of these uprisings are, in the case of Chile, the protagonists tend to be young people. I was going to say like you, but I mean, just because you're young, maybe they're not like you, right? What do you think? Right? And maybe they're different. All right, so young people, maybe not like you, maybe more like me. I don't know. And also, in the case of Bolivia, this is also some of the protagonists behind this uprising are indigenous people. Remember about the genocide? Well, there's still Bolivia, 60% of the population, it is indigenous people, and they are behind some of the uprising and so on. Anyway, the political scientists might look at this and they will frame questions as to what is happening right now in the world, where we see all of these political turmoil and so on. The historian usually is going to look at this differently. And the historian looks at it different for many reasons, but one of the main reasons is because the historian, when he looks at this, they will know that he or she will know the final outcome, right? We don't know what this outcome, what this uprising in Hong Kong or this uprising in Bolivia or in Haiti is going to lead to, right? But the historian will know when he examines this 20, 30, 40 years down the line, right? And he probably will put this in the context of a much broader processes that are taking place in the world. We know that the issues taking place also, maybe not to the same extent, but the example that was mentioned about the United States also shows that there's certain instability in the United States. We are seeing like greater a conflict between and challenges for the two parties to find some kind of a common ground in the United States. A greater divide within the United States society, but also we see examples in Europe and so on. And the historian might try to put this into a broader context of what are the socioeconomic circumstances, what is happening in the world at that time. Anyway, so what I'm saying is that historical thinking tends to affect not just how we analyze the past, but also how we look into the past, how we frame our problems and questions, the ones that we want to solve. And as I mentioned there, this historical thinking is characterized by the importance of chronology in organizing our analysis and our writing. The chronology is crucial. What happens first, what happens second, what happens third, as you can understand, is crucial. And we also always have to have that sort of like, we always have to have that sort of timeline in mind. So when you are taking your notes, it is important that you create a little bit of a, or at least when you organize your notes, you organize them sometimes chronologically. So you, of course, you can organize them by, maybe by topic. Maybe this is about economics or something like that. But also, if you're organizing this into topics, this is my economic section, or this is my social section, also organize it chronologically, because that chronology is going to help with your analysis, as you can easily understand, right? So if you're thinking about Jamaican independence in 1966, right?
62.
Oh, okay. So it was in 1962. So it's an important thing, because if you're gonna know what happens in 1963 Jamaica is already independent. But if you're talking about 1961, Jamaica is not yet independent. So you have to keep in mind that. If you're thinking about, for example, the history of education in Jamaica, history of education, education policies, and so on, that chronology is crucial. Who is in charge? Who is making those decisions? Is the same 62 as 59? Probably not. Clearly not. Is 62 the same as 72 or 74? I don't know. When is it that Manley came to power?
No. 72.
72? Okay, so 72, right? So it's not the same, right? So we say that that chronology will be important, because the chronology means that usually the historian is looking at a relatively long time span. Sometimes it's looking at a period of 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years. So the chronology is important, right? One thing that I usually find with students is that you tend to talk about history as if it was a still picture. So when we talk about like account for the reasons why Africans participated in the trade in enslaved Africans, right? And you start talking about it, and it seems like nothing changed. That the same reasons why they participated in 1652 are the same reasons as why they participated in 1797. They cannot be the same reasons, because the circumstances changed and because the actors were different, right? People were not living like over 100 years, as you can imagine, right? So the actors are different, the circumstances are different. So we have to think in that sort of way, right? And that's an important thing. That's an important thing. The historian is going to provide that notion of change is an important thing. And I'll talk now about change and continuity, but it's important. That chronology is important because we have to look at how different events are related to each other and how they're evolving over time, how they change over time, how they evolve over time, right? I'll give you another example. So when we look at in West African history, when we examine, for example, the reasons why the trade was abolished, right, in 1807, right, and so on. One of the things that we're going to say is that the reasons for the abolition in 1807 are changing, and then we say like, and then when we say like, okay, so in 1807, one of the things that we hear is that the Europeans, especially the abolitionists, are saying that, okay, what we need now is Africans staying in the African continent and producing, right? Because the industries, the factories in Europe need some of the raw materials and so on. All right, so what they do, they say like, we abolish the slave trade, Africans stay in the continent, and once they stay in the continent, it is easier for them to produce and so on. But what happens by 1880, Africa is being colonized. So why the change in policy? Why? Why do you think that they will change the policy? From 1807, they say that Africans stay in Africa and produce and sell your money, sell the raw materials to the Europeans. By 1880s, they decided that no, we are going to colonize you and take over. Why the change? Well, you don't need to know, or you can't know. But one of the things that I will tell you is that students tend to think like, oh, they tend to establish a connection between 1807 and 1880. The people who are colonizing in 1880 are very different, or no, they're not very different, but they are different from the people who abolished the trade in 1807. So those are things that is important, that chronology and so on. Anyway, so it's characterized by the importance of chronology in organizing our analysis and also our writing. All right? So we think chronologically, but we also need to write a little bit chronologically. So let's not talk about things that like in a sort of like you go back and forth in time, because that's one of the things that confuses the reader. All right? If you don't follow kind of some more like a kind of chronological sequence, you're going to confuse the reader. So that's another thing that you have to keep in mind. Awareness of change and continuity. Things change and things remain the same sometimes, right? We will examine that shortly. use of causality, cause and effect, which we will examine as well. Emphasis on multiple causalities. So it's not just the relationship between cause and effect, but especially we are concerned with multiple causality, multiple causes behind to explain a historical event. For multiple causality, as you can imagine, this applies to any discipline. The interplay between long and short-term causes, also important. That's another thing that you need to think of as students of the past. So sometimes things happen in and around, and we mentioned last week, we mentioned the example of the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. And we said, like, okay, the French Revolution might be one of the short-term causes behind the Haitian Revolution. But there will also be long-term causes behind the Haitian Revolution. What is the relationship between those long-term and short-term causes? Sometimes you have to find a way to explain, and sometimes explain why at this particular time these things happen, right? And of course, the relevance of historical context, which we will examine shortly, and that has to do with understanding the context in which, like, historical actors are making decisions and acting and so on. Tell me what's going on. Oh, the sharks. Okay. So it's distracting you. It's distracting. All right, let me take it now. Chronology. So the chronology. Let's examine chronology. The chronology helps us to sort out historical events. I mentioned that. So we can arrange our research material in chronological order. I hope you take this into account, please. You know, use this kind of techniques. When you are finding information, especially factual information, the first thing that the historian is going to ask, when did it happen? Because depending on the when, it can help me to provide an explanation or another, right? So the when of the facts is important. Don't just take notes and say, like, oh, 3 million people or like 600,000 people were traded. When 600,000 people were traded? And that's an important question that the historian needs to understand. So it helps us to arrange our research material, all the information that we are gathering, but also it helps us with our analysis, as I just mentioned. And sometimes it helps us to identify common historical features. This is another thing that the historian sometimes can see. If we are thinking chronologically, and we see that, oh, in different parts of the world, maybe in different parts of the region, in and around the same time, these things are happening. We can see patterns, right? So some of the causes might be local, but we see that there might be some other regional factors that are affecting this. And hence we see these similarities or these concurrence of events at the same time. One of the things that we do, of course, is that we tend to periodize, like we create divisions, different historical periods, and that's one of the things that you have already become familiar with. So we tend to create historical periods in which, like, we see certain similarities: ancient, medieval, modern, contemporary. What's the problem with ancient, medieval, contemporary, modern, and contemporary history periods? Any issue with that? So we tend to create historical periods in which, like, we see similarities, right? So we talk about, this is ancient history. This is medieval history. Oh, this is more like contemporary history, close to our time, right? So maybe 20th century, it's contemporary history because it's very close to the contemporary era. So what is the problem with that? We create these divisions based on based on similarities that we see.
Sir,
Mm-hmm.
the only problem I can think of that might be a problem is, what if there's something that
You need to speak up a little bit, sorry.
what if there's something that happened in history that doesn't necessarily fall into one of those categories? Yeah, that's the only thing I can think of.
All right. So that's the thing, is that historical periods, for example, when we talk about antiquity and we talk about the type of states, the type of social organizations, the type of economic activities, and so on, right? We see similarities. And yeah, similarities doesn't mean that everything is the same. So there will be differences from one place to another, but overall we see similarities. So those societies of Rome or those societies of Persia are more similar to each other than Rome in ancient times is to Rome today, right? The people of Persia in the first century of the Common Era are more similar to the people of Rome in the first century of the Common Era than they are to the people of Persia today, to the people of Iran, for reasons that you can easily understand, right? So those are things in which like that's why we create this. The problem with this periodization that historians create is that it also, we tend to think of this developed out of European history, right? And this kind of corresponds with changes in European or Eurasian history, but they don't quite apply to maybe to other parts of the world. So when we talk about Asian history and we think, okay, Asian history maybe before the 7th century of the Common Era or something like that, it depends, because those similarities, we can find later on those similarities in other parts of the world and so on. So they're very much circumscribed to a particular region of the world. This is why it's problematic. The characteristics of modern societies in Europe, right, at that particular time in history, are different from what we see in African or Asian societies at that time, right? So this is why sometimes this periodization is not valid. We also create other periodizations that are valid to us. So the slave period. The slave period is valid to the American societies, for example. Might not be valid to other societies because they might be referring to other times in history. Like slavery in Europe was dominant, but in ancient times, right? Not at the same time that it was dominant in the Americas. Colonial period is another thing that helps us, right? Because it creates, so there are periodizations that are valid to specific places or parts of the world and so on. And of course, we use chronological markers to locate events through time. And it's important, when you provide information, just tell me. You don't have to say the year, the exact year. But it's important that you say maybe it's in the early 16th century. Is it in the mid 18th century? Or it's in the, I don't know, in the late 10th century. Those things are important because then you start thinking historically. You start thinking in terms of like, okay, events take place in a particular time in history. And they might be valid at that particular time and not, and explanations might be valid at that particular time and not at another time. So it's important to start thinking chronologically, to start thinking historically. It's important that we start locating events and explanations. So I might say, by the late 1700s, right, the growing presence of African-born enslaves in Haiti led to maybe, I don't know, growing rebellions and things like that. One of the things is like what we say is that the growth of the African-born enslaved people in Haiti is one of the factors that led to greater instability. Because of course, controlling people who were born free, who were raised free, is much harder than controlling people who were born enslaved and so on, right? So that's one of the things that why, so we will think chronologically in terms of like thinking, okay, this trend is starting to happen in the latter part of the 17th century, or sorry, of the 18th century and so on. That's thinking chronologically, and by thinking chronologically, we started to think historically. So change, an important thing. For us as students of the past, why change is so important? And this change and the continuity is where I'm going to try to concentrate a little bit more, because this is how I want you to start thinking differently. So we say that we study the past. What is in the past is in the past. What happened, happened, right? Fine. But yet we don't write we write about the past, but we don't write the past. We write history, right? What is in the past is in the past. What happened doesn't mean that the past was always the same. The past is changing. Just like our society is changing, so was the past. The past is, yeah, our past was changing, right? It's not changing now. The past is there. But imagine this society 50 years from now. What you would think is like this society, Jamaica in the late 2010s. It was not a static society, right? For somebody it would be in the past, but that past, it was a changing past. Every day something was happening. And sometimes what things that were happening were leading to some kind of like significant change. Sometimes to some kind of small or short small change and so on. So societies are dynamic. And this is why history is necessary. If the past had always been the same, we don't need historians. We just need somebody to tell us okay, societies were like this and like that, you know? And once you create that sort of picture, you don't need anybody to tell you more. Yeah, they were like this in the year 1000, and the same can be applied to the year 1200, or the same can be applied to the year 1600. That's a notion of a past that does not change. But we know that that's not possible. A society, any society in the year 1000 will not be the same. The same society, the same place will not be the same in the year 1200 or in the year 1500. Those societies are changing. Sometimes the changes are not very radical. And yes, we know that with industrialization, one of the things that we have seen is that changes tend to be more rapid and sometimes more dramatic, right? That's one of the things that we see. But the fact that changes tend to be more rapid and more dramatic does not mean that in the past, changes did not take place, right? So the pace of change may have varied. The pace of change has certainly increased, but change did happen. And that's why history is necessary, to show how the change was happening, to explain why the change happened. Okay, a society was not the same in the year 1000 as it was in the year 1300. Why? Why did they change? Why do we change? 1962, 2019. Has your society changed? Hey, some people say that 1962 things were not so bad. The economy was kind of like expanding, right? There was much less violence. People tend to be more friendly, all of those things. So yeah, what happened? Why did we change? Why didn't we stay the same? You know, if things were like some people tend to describe, I don't know if is it me the only one who has heard these things about the 1960s or in and around the time of independence? How in many ways Jamaica was in a better place. Nobody has heard these things before.
I've heard that.
Yeah, you heard that before, right? If we were in a better place, why did we have to mess it up? Well, I wasn't here. Right, but I mean, and neither were you. Well, you were here for part of the time. So why did we mess it up? Why didn't we just stay the same? Why do societies change? Okay, so now you're going to tell me. Why did we change?
We changed because
Now remember when we didn't have to lock the doors, we didn't need burglar bars and those sort of things?
Or maybe,
I don't remember that, you know.
maybe it was introduction, new technology, new addition to society. Like if something new comes to the island and people get pretty much, then it could cause things to change.
So sometimes technology creates change, right? Innovations generate change. But here's the thing, you don't have to embrace the innovation. Now for example, we're talking about AI, right?
mm-hmm.
So what are the concerns with AI?
So it could turn evil and turn against us.
I mean, that's Terminator, yes. But other than Terminator, there are other concerns which might be a little bit more realistic. I'm not saying that it's not possible. I'm not saying it's not possible. Well, I'm saying that there are other concerns. Nobody has heard of other concerns about AI?
Also,
So
sometimes they don't know this differentiation between certain things that humans.
Okay, so they don't think like us. They don't feel like us.
Yeah,
But Coswell, what else?
Think,
No,
something is good.
AI, sorry,
AI.
artificial intelligence.
Oh,
What are some of the concerns that have been expressed by other people? Yes.
They're placing human capital, so all the persons will lose employment.
Employment, right? What do you guys want to do after you finish here? Find a job, right? Hopefully. I mean, not that you want, really want. It's more like that you need it, right? I understand that. You really want it. So you need it, exactly. So that's why I say it's not that you really want. But, I mean, I do really want, you know, no. Some days I want it, some other days I don't. But anyway, yes, exactly. Replacing is the problem with AI, technological innovations are leading to greater complexity and greater efficiency of artificial intelligence. And one of the challenges that some people are talking about is how this is going to affect our ability to find employment. We know that in many cases, robots have replaced humans in factories and things like that. But now we're talking about not just like mechanical work, we're talking about artificial intelligence. Right? So a robot or a machine that can do complex operations, the ones that we thought that only us were able to do, right? You might not have a job. I mean, I don't know why we're here, guys. What's the point? No, I'm just joking. No, but here's the thing. What I'm trying to say is, if that's one concern, and it sounds like a very serious concern, why are we going in that direction? Why not stopping right there? And on top of that, as David mentioned, on top of that, they might even turn against us, right? So why not stop it? Why not just like, you know what, forget it. Let's go back to the old days and with like the machines are pretty rudimentary and the rest of the work is done by us.
There's a reason because we're lazy people. We tend to be lazy people.
Not only.
Jobs to be easy, but I mean, if there are no jobs, they'll not be easy at all. It's just like there will not be jobs. I mean, look at this. A society in which like you don't find employment. What are the risks of a society in which like young people like you?
More idleness. More idle nature would cause more chaos.
All right, so there might be instability. There might be people. Okay, those concerns are there. What I'm trying to say here is that just because technological innovation happens, it doesn't mean that we have to embrace it. Yet, that is, there are conscious decisions by some historical actors, maybe not every historical actor, to embrace those changes and go in that direction, right? So we don't have the ability to decide we're not going to use AI. But if I am a business owner, right, maybe I decide, you know what? Yeah, I need some of this AI technology so I can make more money. And then that historical actor or that actor has made a decision that is shaping our society. Right? So there are people making those decisions, and in that sense, it's not that technology it just falls from the sky, you know, as if it was the rain and there's nothing we can do about it. Technology, someone is developing and someone is deciding to use it. So change is not just because it just happens. We embrace it. And things change and societies change. And why? Why our society seems to be embracing this when we know that there are some challenges? Right? Why our society has changed, this one in particular, has changed since 1962. Those are the historians, those are the questions that the historians will try to answer. The thing is that society has changed. And that much is clear. And some look at it from a romantic perspective and they think, oh, it has changed for the worse. More violent and stuff like that. Some of the people say, like, hey, hang on a second, look at it. You know, just look at this classroom. This would not be possible in 1962. It would be a very small classroom, and most of the people here probably wouldn't look like you, wouldn't come from your kind of income level or whatever it is. I don't know what your income level is, but you know that it was a particular type of individuals that had gained access to tertiary education in Jamaica in 1962, and it was a very small minority of society, right? So we see that sometimes we look at the past with some kind of romantic eyes, and sometimes it's true. Of course, probably I think it's without a doubt that 1962 society in Jamaica was less violent, or there was less crime or violent crime, and so on. But it doesn't mean that everything that has happened is necessarily worse from there.
Look at it from an objective point of view, sir. Crime was not bad in 1962, but crime being bad now, it has its advantages also. So, one, for example, in Montego Bay, crime brings in the most income.
More than tourism?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So extortion and all those things bring in billions.
Yeah, but tourism also brings me billions.
Not like extortion.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have somebody here who knows something that we don't know. No, I'm just joking. But yeah, but I agree with you.
Yes.
So of course, societies directly or indirectly benefit from criminal activities. Huh? Societies. I'm saying societies because at the end of the day, I think the point has been made is that generates some sort of economic activity which is illicit. But that illicit economic activity goes into, oh, now with this money, I'm going to go and buy a car. I'm going to go to the restaurant, right?
So it impacts a lot of persons.
I'm going to buy a house. Somebody who has to build it.
So it impacts the car dealership.
Mm-hmm.
It impacts the security forces because the car dealership, you have the scammers, so they need to buy cars. I need to get cars.
They want to.
They want to buy cars, so I need to get cars so I can supply to them.
Yeah.
Need more police, so the government has to employ more people. So it has a
They
chain
should.
reaction. Should.
Yeah.
It has a chain reaction of change.
Yeah, the security company, there's more crime, we need more security. So another business idea there. I need a house, so I'm going to need people to build the house, right? And so on. So yeah, we see all of those things. So no matter what, the issue is that whether we want it or not, in some cases, change is inevitable. And it's inevitable not because it falls from the sky. It's inevitable because there are particular actors that will make decisions, right, that will affect societies and so on. And sometimes also change happens because there's a level of dissatisfaction. No matter what we may say about 1962, clearly Jamaican society was not satisfied with the state of affairs in 1962. That's why in the first place you wanted independence, right? You wanted independence because you thought that you will have a better future, right? So there was dissatisfaction, and that dissatisfaction led to certain actions. The problem is, of course, some of those actions now will have some positive effects, if you like, but some of the actions will have some side effects, which will not be as positive, and so on. So that thing is that societies change, and we need, as historians, we need to understand why they change. Why they changed in 1962, why they changed in 1804, right? Those are the kind of questions that we need to address. So all societies have always changed, and they continue to change, right? Most changes in society tend to be relatively small. Some of those changes we don't realize, and it's only in retrospect, in hindsight, that we say, oh, some of those changes. So many of those changes are happening in front of our eyes, and we don't really notice because they are relatively small. Those are the majority of those changes. Major changes tend to have a greater impact, but are less common, right? And that's another thing that we say is like, and this is a problem. I mean, this is good. If there were significant changes every year, what we will have is what? Instability, right? Remember, we can apply the same concept as climate change. The climate has been changing since the beginning of time, but that climate change was very gradual, very slow. So humans, animals, plants, they could adjust to those changes. But when the changes are dramatic, then we don't have time to adapt. So that's the thing, is like if our societies were changing dramatically every year, there would be a lot of instability, and nobody wants to live in an unstable society, right? So for the most part, change in society tends to be gradual, and that's good because it makes it easier for us to live in these societies. Only when change is more acute, we speak about sometimes revolutionary changes. Some people, and let's go back, if we go back to the issue of technology, some people say like, okay, we don't see the type of revolutions in terms of political revolutions, but it's a technological revolution that they say we seem to be going through. The outcome of this, we don't know, right? But you as young people might be able to study the 2010s and what was happening in this decade. 30 years down the line, it's like, okay, knowing what the outcome of some of the changes that are taking place now were. Right? So change is inevitable. And one important thing, as people of African descent thinking about change, why change is important? Because basically I told you, change is an acceptance that all societies change. No societies are static. If societies change, it means that we have to study that change, and in studying that change, we write the history of those societies. However, when we say that some societies have never changed or did not change, we're saying that those societies were static, primitive, backward, and there was no need for history. And African societies in the 19th century and 20th century, that's what we're told about African society. Oh, no change happened here. Yeah, the stage in which we found them in 1880 is the same stage that they were in the year 1000 or maybe 3000 years ago. No change took place. They are primitive, backward, no change. No history necessary. Let's just send anthropologists. Anthropologists will tell us what these societies are like, right? And by telling us what these societies are like, we will know what these societies used to be like I don't know, 2000 years ago. The denial of change, the denial of history, in a sense, is a way to belittle people. So when you don't embrace the notion that societies have history, and it's important to think about the society's history and the changes through time, when you don't embrace that, in a way, you're contributing to belittling your society. I will say something else. I'm obviously a society that does not think historically. It's very difficult that it's going to make sense of its future. But anyway, that's another point, another time, for another time. Continuity. So change, things change, societies change, but also historians are also aware that even though our main focus is change, and we know that change is inevitable, we also know that societies tend to be reluctant to change. Societies tend to be reluctant to change. For reasons, some of the reasons have to do with this kind of general explanation that I just provided. Change sometimes is scary, uncertain. So we just prefer to, I just prefer to stay. And now it's not the best situation, but hey, just in case. So societies tend to be reluctant to change, tend to maintain or protect the status quo. We tend to be conservative. Those leading change, in some cases, tend to be a minority. Whether it is political, social, technological, economic change, they tend to be the minority. In a way, change means taking risks and that uncertainty that I mentioned. However, as conservative or as reluctant to change as we may be, we know one thing, that there are times in history when we, even as we can be conservative, we are more open to change. The times in history in which we are more open to change. Why? That's a question that the historian will ask. Why the society is more open to change now than before? Let me give you an example that will lead to our next case study, which is Cape Town, South Africa, apartheid. Well, we're not going to study apartheid. But one of the things that I want you to think about is racial discrimination in South Africa. So we know that from the early 20th century, a group of educated Africans organized themselves to fight against racial discrimination in South Africa. For the most part, it was just a minority of black people in South Africa who participated in the struggle against apartheid. Yes, 1 second. And then, in the 1970s, we start to say that more and more people joined the struggle. At some point in history, we will see that societies tend to be more prone to change, to take risks, and to demand that change. That's one of the questions that historians tend to ask. Why now? Why society is more prone to change now? Yes, also.
No, you were just making an example.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Not that you were studying.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. But change even though we know that societies are conservative and reluctant to change, we also know that change happens. And at the same time that change happens, many things tend to remain. This is when we talk about continuity, the legacy, if you like, right? This is what historians call social, political, and economic or cultural inertia. There are many things that are not possible to change overnight. There's always an inertia, things that exist in society. Even though changes have been introduced, there will things that will remain. In a sense, basically, what we know is that that balance or that relationship between change and continuity is the best way to explain the past. What are the things that change? What are the things that continue, that continue or that remain? Right? And that's how we have to think historically. Change and continuity. Historians need to assess the balance or the relationship between change and continuity. What are the things that are changing and why? What are the things that are remain and why? So yesterday, for example, I was reading a draft of a former student of mine who was writing about education in Jamaica. And there was an element, a section of it in which like she was talking about the kind of classist structure of the educational system in Jamaica, in which like we have the traditional high schools and the non-traditional high schools and so on. And the point is made like, oh, this is a legacy of colonialism. Yes, that's continuity, right? But the historian will ask, why is this thing continuing? Not because it was created during the colonial era, it means that we have to maintain it today. If we maintain it today, there must be a reason why we maintain it today. Some might want to keep it. Maybe we don't have the resources to change it. Whatever the reasons are, we need to understand. So the legacies of the continuities, we cannot just accept it as like, oh, you know, legacy of the past and so on. No, we need to understand the extent to which societies are changing, the extent to which societies are maintaining some of these legacies and explain why. The extent, while accounting both for change and continuity. In a sense, historians focus on both changes and continuities. That's what we really study, changes and continuity. Explaining how both concepts influence each other. That is how continuities limit the extent of change. So sometimes the change is limited because of those forces that tend to maintain things as they are. Yes. So, continuities limit the extent of change, and changes modify the continuities within society. This is the last point I'm going to make for now. Changes modify continuities within societies. What do I mean by this? Let's go back to the example of the educational system in Jamaica. Yeah, based on the kind of elitist English system, right? The traditional high school versus the non-traditional high school. However, we know that things are not the same. Yeah, we have the traditional high schools, but whereas in the past, people who gained access to traditional high schools came from a relatively privileged background, today we know that there are people who don't come from that background and have access. So we see some of the changes in society have modified the continuity. The continuity is the kind of like traditional high school versus non-traditional. But that continuity is not the same as it was in 1959, right? We know that access to these traditional high schools has opened up to students who come from less privileged backgrounds and so on. So that's how the student of the past has to think, that relationship between changes and continuities and how they influence each other. We're going to take a short break, and we will continue in 5 minutes. 5 minutes is enough? This is a democracy. Thank you. All right, let's continue. So let's continue with this discussion. Change and continuity, important for you to think in those sort of terms. If you write a paper, or you do a presentation in which you show, in which you apply principles like this, in which you explain the extent to which like certain elements change after the Haitian Revolution, but at the same time you talk about like certain legacies and so on. That is you applying change and continuity, and that's you showing the reader, the listener, that you understand that history is a complex discipline, and that requires complex thinking to reflect that past. And you are applying, of course, principles of historical thinking. What else? Of course, cause and effect. And I think this one, or causation, this one requires much less explanation. So I'll go quickly through this, because cause and effect or causation is applied to all kinds of disciplines and sciences and so on. So thinking historically also requires seeing causal relationships, cause and effect relationships. Give meaning. It is this relationship between cause and effect that give meaning to past events. Those connections between those causes and those effects and so on. That's what gives meaning to the past. You explain that relationship. That relationship is not, in some cases, might be very clear, very evident, but not necessarily in all cases. And you being able to show the relevance or the connection between certain causes and a particular effects or events, that's you providing an explanation, a complex explanation. As we explain the effect of any past event on subsequent events, that's another thing. One particular event, one particular historical event will have repercussions on future on subsequent events and so on. That's part of how you will be analyzing and writing about the past. Cause and effect relationships are often complex, as I mentioned. Some of them are a little bit more evident, but in some cases it might be much less evident, and in that sense they're more complex. One of the things that I mentioned there, causal relationships tend to be multi-directional. That is, one particular event or cause may have different effects. So there's no linear relationship. One cause, one effect. No, one cause, right? Multiple events. But actually it's more multiple causes and multiple effects. That's how that complexity that we have to understand. We need to decide which effects are most relevant to our study. That's one of the things that you also will have to think. Assess the impact of. Assess the impact of is telling you to think about cause and effect. And there are multiple effects. However, by telling you or asking you to assess the impact of, one of the first things that you will have to do is to decide which of these effects do I think is most important, right? So you will select, like, these to me are the main three effects of the Haitian Revolution on slavery in Jamaican society, for example, So those, and you will identify those effects, and in doing that, you will decide which ones you think are most relevant. They're not the only ones, but you are the ones that to you are most relevant for reasons that you will explain in your presentation, your essay, or, I don't know, your documentary. Those causal relationships are subject to interpretation. That's the thing. Cause and effect. You first are interpreting what is the relationship between a particular cause and a particular effect. And at the same time that you are doing that, you are also interpreting which effects tend to be more, which causes tend to be more relevant, because there are multiple causes, as we will see, and which effects tend to be more significant for the nature of your study. So really and truly, it's not just causality, it's multiple causality that historians tend to think of. While people tend to highlight a single cause, in explaining historical events, right? We tend to think like, okay, the abolition of slavery, or it's because sugar no longer became profitable, and the Europeans or the English were more concerned with serving the interests of the manufacturers, of the industrialists in England. That would be a single cause. Might be the most important cause, And that's a point that you can make, but it's not the only one. What else? What else happened that led to the evolution, right? That's you thinking in terms of multiple causality. But in regular conversations, we tend to highlight one single cause. And that is fine in a regular conversation. But when you are writing history, you can just not highlight one, even though you may say that this is the most important, and this might be your thesis statement. And I will prove X, Y, like Y, and so on. That would be your thesis statement. But you will, at the same time, you will address all the causes that may have led to that particular historical event. So we're thinking of the Haitian Revolution. What's the cause behind the Haitian Revolution? It is the French Revolution. It is the North American Revolution, or the US Revolution. It is the, I don't know, the conditions of the enslaved people, you know, in Haiti, the level of exploitation. Yes.
With regards to there's a question for this one.
Mm-hmm.
Are we supposed to look at the actual recognition, actual causes of the Haitian Revolution?
No.
Okay.
You're more concerned with explaining how some of these principles help us to understand the past. And you can use the Haitian Revolution as an example, or no, you should use the Haitian Revolution as an example. So we're more concerned with the historical thinking, right? How the historical thinking help us to make sense of the past. And you use the Haitian Revolution as an example in which like we can apply some of these principles, like change and continuity or multiple causality and things like that. All right? So while people tend to highlight a single cause in explaining historical events, not just historical events, present events, right? And it's the same thing, journalism. It depends on what type of journalism you're doing. You might highlight one particular event because maybe you are asked to write like a 500 word column. Of course, you're not going to be able to elaborate much, right? But if you have a longer piece, you say like, I'm writing for a monthly magazine and I'm writing like maybe 3,500 words, you might be better able then to apply multiple causality and so on. So those things obviously play a factor. But multiple causality, as I said, not only determines or the single cause explanation is not just something that people tend to do when studying, when looking into the past, also even the present. Students of history understand that there is always more than a single cause. Multiple causality is therefore part of historical thinking, not just exclusively of historical thinking, but is an essential part of historical thinking. Historical events are the result of interrelated causes. The extent to which you can show how different causes relate to each other, leading to one particular event, the Haitian Revolution in this case, right? The extent to which you can show that, that's the extent to which like you are applying historical thinking, complex thinking, right? And remember, I told you, like, if we are trying to find explanations to complex problems, we cannot provide simple explanations. A complex problem requires a complex explanation, though the complex explanation has to be explained in an intelligible manner. So so there's no contradiction between complexity and making something intelligible. So historical events are the result of interrelated causes. Let me just check something. I think the microphone is on. So this is the thing that I was mentioning before. While we could identify endless causes in explaining the past, we need to identify those that we believe to be the most important from the perspective of our historical problem and research question. That's the thing, is I remember I told you, yeah, there are multiple causes behind it, but you're not going to, like, let's say that behind the Haitian Revolution, we can identify, for argument's sake, 20 causes leading to the Haitian Revolution. You're not going to address the 20 causes in your presentation, right? That wouldn't make sense. So you will identify maybe how many? 3, 4, 5, 2, depending, right? If it's a short presentation, I'm going to concentrate on these two causes and so on. If it's a little bit longer presentation, I have like 45 minutes. Okay, I'll concentrate on these 4 causes behind it and so on. If it's a short paper, like 1,000 words, like maybe I will only be able to address 2, right? But if it's a longer paper, 3,000 words, like let me see, like this, like 4 or 5 causes behind the Haitian Revolution. So how do you determine which ones? Which are the causes? If there are 20, but you are going to focus on 3, how do you determine which 3? Huh? Causes, yeah, but in terms of like, they're all related to, they're all causes that lead to the effect. They're all causes that lead to the Haitian Revolution. But which ones of this, out of the 20, which 3? How do we determine which 3 we are going to focus on?
To look at what was happening at the time.
All right.
Surrounding those causes.
All right. So let's focus on one answer here. One is a practical answer. The ones that I have more information about, I will focus on that. If we have more information, that's telling us that what? Why there will be more information? That's a sign or a clue that it might be more important, right? More people are writing about it, and more people are writing more about it. We had a different position there. Yes.
Maybe the effects are still being seen and
Okay. All right. So maybe it has to do more with our approach. If we want to if we talk about if we approach the causes of the Haitian Revolution from the perspective of certain continuities, right, into the present, then we might focus on those factors or those causes that have more relevance from the perspective of the continuities that we still see in Haiti. So, for example, if I'm a journalist, I might be more concerned with continuities. I might want to write about political violence. Political violence is happening in Haiti, right? And I want to write about political violence from a historical perspective, but of course, my main focus is the present because I'm a journalist, I'm not a historian. So in talking about the Haitian Revolution as one first instance of political violence, I might focus on those things that I see are more relevant to the present in terms of the continuities. So the approach also determines. So one has to do with the information, and the information is related to perhaps what other historians may consider to be more important. The other has to do with maybe our approach. And our approach might be like we put more emphasis on the continuities in the present, and that will determine which causes we are going to focus on. Other things have to do sometimes with the way in which the question, from an essay perspective question, the way in which the question is asked. The question might be asked in a way that it is seeking us to, it's asking us to examine one central problem behind the beginning of the Haitian Revolution. So depending on what is the central issue highlighted by the essay question, I might determine, okay, this is the main problem here. So in relation to this problem, these 3 causes seem to be more important, right? If the question is assess the ways in which like the international context led to the Haitian Revolution, right? That might determine that I'm going to focus on different causes that have to do with the outside world and so on, or not. But I mean, that's a way in which like the question is maybe addressing a fundamental issue. What is the relevance of the international factor in the Haitian Revolution? So in order to do that, I will have to look more at those external causes and so on. So that will determine which causes I highlight. To develop, so we need to identify those that we believe to be the most important causes from the perspective of our historical problem, research question, and as it became clear, also our approach. In doing that, we will be able to develop an intelligible historical argument that helps us to make sense of the past, right? By determining which are the most important causes, rather than talking about 20, we can create an intelligible historical argument. That's why the decision is important, that we determine, we choose which are the most important causes. This is what we call historical analysis. So this is part of the historical analysis. But in doing this, in conducting this historical analysis, of course, we need to be aware of the historical context, something that is very relevant to the historian. This is perhaps, to me, along with change and continuity and chronology, historical context is one of the things that differentiates historical writing more from other types of writing. One of the things that sometimes as a historian, when I read things that talk about the past, like one of the things that I see is that the historical context is not taken into account. The historical context is a particular time and a particular place. Whatever might be valid for that particular time and place might not be valid for a different time or a different place. Right? The historian is always very aware of that. And if I'm going to understand violence in 21st century society, in 21st century societies today, as a historian, okay, I deal with the past, but you asking me to understand violence today, in this day and age, my main question will be where, right? Because to me, I will need a particular context. The where. Is it violence in Jamaica or violence in South Africa or violence in Haiti? There might be similarities, but we also know that there are particular factors that apply to this particular context. The context is important for the historian, and that context, or the student of the past. And that context is not just a place, it's not just a time, sorry, it is also a place. So historical analysis must always be done in relation to historical context. That is, we must do our analysis taking the historical context in mind, identifying the relevant historical actors and factors at the time. Who and what matters at that time? Who are the actors? What are the factors at that time, in that place? Distancing ourselves from the historical actors. That's a problem that sometimes students of history, sometimes we're trying to give an explanation based on how we understand the relevance. Okay, so we try to understand the decisions of a particular historical actor. And we do it by way of like, okay, this was happening. So, and this is what he did. So my understanding is that he did this because he was greedy, right? But that's you understanding this from the perspective, your perspective, how you analyze this. But you are asked to analyze this from the perspective of that individual at that particular time, which is a different individual from you, different society, different mentality, and so on. So distancing ourselves from the historical actors, that's something that is relevant, is necessary. Understanding that the past, their present, the past that we are looking at is their present. It's different from our present. That is, our society is different from the ones that we study. And sometimes it's like, it is Jamaica in 1600, or it is Jamaica in 1900. Same place, different times, different people, different mentalities. It is Jamaica in 1962, it's Jamaica in 2019. Well, not that distance, but it's still different people. They're not exactly the same people. Yeah, of course, there are more similarities between you and somebody from 1962 than between you and somebody from 1862. But it's still not quite the same. So that's what we do when we think about the historical context. We must try to see historical actors as they saw themselves. This requires deep understanding of the societies that we study. What is the culture? What is the religion? What is the worldview? What is the importance of, I don't know, the economy at the time? You know? Those are all things. So it requires a deep understanding of that society. If we try to understand why they're acting in that particular way, we have to have understanding of different factors of what these societies were like. So we can have a better sense of why these actors made or took those decisions. So this requires, as I said, an understanding of the societies that we study, and understanding that while historical actors' actions respond to their motivations, ultimately, they are not aware of the outcomes of their actions. That's another thing that is important, right? The historical actors may do something seeking to achieve something. Whatever it is that they're seeking to achieve is not necessarily the result that they obtain. And that difference is an important thing. So, for example, I'll tell you about colonial Africa and the struggle against colonial rulers, the rise of the anti-colonial nationalist movement. Okay, so we see that some of these leaders that led their societies to independence later on became authoritarian rulers. Oh, it is because they wanted to kick out the Europeans independent, so they will have all the power to themselves. Simple as that. Maybe not. Whatever it is that they wanted in 1950, 1957, 1959, when they were fighting against the colonial rulers, you know, then things may happen that led them to different circumstances. So by 1965, the circumstances are different. It doesn't mean that what they wanted in 1955 wasn't like the betterment of their society. It's that sometimes maybe they realized that the economies collapsed. Maybe they realized that the resources that they had in their hands were very small. Maybe they realized that there was a lot of competition. So, you know, that it was very difficult to rule societies in which like we have like very heterogeneous societies and so on. So we have to think about that the historical actors are unaware of the outcome of their actions. That's the outcome of their actions, we know, but they don't. And we have to take this into account. In other words, we must not explain historical actions on the basis of the final outcome. Rather, we must explain historical actions on the basis of their motivations. Why did they do that, right? So that's how we can understand better the actions of some individual, what their motivations were, rather than what the final outcome were. Sometimes, yeah, maybe sometimes we will see that the outcome is the same as what they aspire to achieve, right? Oh, they wanted independence, yeah, and they gain it. But maybe not the type of independence that they actually gain in the end. Anyway, all of this is part of what helps us to do what we call historical analysis. And that historical analysis requires the application of some of these principles and concepts that we just mentioned: chronology, historical context, change and continuity, all of those things, among other things. And in performing this historical analysis, we tend to break down any given historical event into multiple parts. What are the components of this? In doing that, we have to understand how the events, the multiple parts of the event interconnect, right? So sometimes what we do is that we look at isolated parts. That's when you think like, I'm going to look at the economic factors. Maybe I'm going to look at the social factors. In a sense, they're all connected. It's not in a society you can differentiate things so clearly. What we do is that we break it down. So by breaking it down, it makes it easier for us to understand the realities, the complex realities that we are studying. And how we do that, of course, this analysis of these multiple parts, we do it through the elaboration of questions that guide our research, through the examination of credible sources. But in reality, a historical event is only part of a broader historical developments. And that's what sometimes we need to think, that this historical event is related to broader developments. They're part of the historical developments that are taking place and so on. So that's another thing, is like how we connect one particular historical event to broader historical developments that are taking place at the time. And that's why, to do that, as I mentioned before, we might need to examine multiple factors and actors, such as the role of key individuals, competition between interest groups, economic conditions, influence of ideas, old and new ideas, long-standing factors, contingency. Contingency sometimes is an important thing. You know, sometimes one of the factors was contingency, chance. Something happened. You know, there are things that sometimes happen that they were not meant to happen, and that trigger particular reactions in society. Remember how I was telling you about how a significant number of South Africans joined the struggle against apartheid in the 1970s? I'll tell you one of the things that happened is that in 1976, a group of students, and I think I mentioned this example before, in 1976, a group of high school students in South Africa, in Johannesburg, in Soweto, marched in protest against one of the education policies implemented by the South African government, by the white supremacist South African government. It was a peaceful demonstration. But that peaceful demonstration turned into a violent reaction in which, like, the police shot at the children. That's a chance. It may not have happened. You know, if that police officer had not decided that at that point to shoot these children, right? Then maybe it would have been yet another peaceful demonstration. But that reaction, that chance reaction, if you like, led to the broader society, the parents of those children, to become much and more involved in the struggle. They realize that, okay, so we are fighting against a state that is not just repressing our leaders, it's also shooting our children. That's a chance factor. What if they had not shot at those children at that time? Maybe the struggle against apartheid would have continued, but not in the way that it did. Not in the way in which it gathered speed at this particular time. So among the many factors, sometimes the historian has to search for, is there anything in particular that happened at that time? A chance, a contingency, right? All of this is what helps us understand how historical problems and research questions, right? So we use all of these, this historical analysis and so on. I don't know if you had something to say? No? Anyway, the last point I want to make about historical thinking is that, in a sense, this is something that we develop. We can explain, and I have explained this, and I have explained what are some of the main features of historical thinking. But that's not something that, you can just overnight develop. This is kind of a habit that we develop. And a habit that we develop and that we master through practice. As you engage in historical research, and as you try to provide more and more nuanced and complex answers, right, you will be able to develop this, what we call historical thinking. In a sense, it's an evolving process. And the evolving process is never finishes. I mean, when I completed my PhD in 2007, I wrote my PhD. This what else can, this is, and I look at it, and the examiner says nothing to be corrected. This is very good. As it is, you can submit it. Whoa, I put together these 120,000 words. Yeah, 120,000 words. But very nicely put together, very nice words. This is a great achievement. I dedicated 5 years of my life, of my young life, to this. Right? Yes, 5 years of my life. That takes commitment, For what? How young? I was young, No, I was older than you. But I dedicated those 5 years of my life, and I said, whoa. But then, as I look back into it, I realized how much more complex my historical thinking is today than it was then. 2007, yes, you get your PhD, you think okay, this is it. No, this is not it. If you continuously, as years go by, especially if you're dedicated to the discipline, you evolve and you become better at thinking about these sort of things. And it's the same thing will happen to you. You have done history. Some of you have done history in high school. You will now do history your first year. And the idea is that you will become better at applying this kind of historical thinking. It's always a change. It's an evolving process. And the last point I want to make, that evolving process sometimes requires feedback. You see, when you present, you might think that, oh no, Dr. Kenville just sees problems here all the time. No, that's well, the thing, I tell you, if I like this is good, I will tell you. But if there are problems, I will tell you. That's the feedback. That's the feedback that helps it to do better. When I submitted my dissertation, that dissertation wasn't the first draft, wasn't even the second. I think it was the third draft, right? And every draft, you get feedback from your supervisor. And that's how you become better. And the process continues. It's an ongoing process. Anyway, so we're going to stop this unit here. And I'm going to very quickly introduce our next and last unit. We only have one unit anyway. I don't know how we're going to do this. But I'm just going to very quickly talk next week I'm going to tell you the history of Cape Town in 20 minutes next week, between today and then we'll talk about narrative and putting together a historical narrative. All right.
This is
About Ready? All right. So we have understood, or we have tried to understand the nature of what we're doing here, studying the past. We have tried to see how we go about understanding the past, the problems and the questions and so on. We also try to understand how that study of the past relies on the use of sources and sources that provide information that had to be analyzed on the basis of this historical thinking, right? All of that is clear. We say this is the different stages and so on. So now we are in the process of the final stage, which is putting all of this together, presenting some sort of comprehensible narrative, whether it is in the form of an essay, whether it is in the form of a presentation, or whether it is in the form of some sort of like digital project, whether it is a documentary or maybe a blog entry or something like that, right? How we put all of this together. Of course, each of these formats like require there are differences between all of them, but in a sense, what they all share is that we create a narrative. We create some sort of narrative in which, like, it is important to tell some sort of story, right? It's important to tell some sort of story. We can't just present all the events from the past, all the factors. These are all the factors. No, we have to tell story. Stories is how we really learn, right? If I just provide information to you, if I just throw it out there, it makes it difficult. I mean, one way sometimes it's like we memorize, right? There's no narrative, like the multiplication tables, right? So we memorize those sort of things. But those are things that's data that we need to memorize. But other things, like in terms of like telling more complex, discussing more complex issues, we need to tell some sort of story. And that's how, from time immemorial, we develop that ability to tell stories. And sometimes the stories, the tales, and the parables, and all of that, they wanted to create some sort of, or give some sort of lesson, right? So we will learn about it. That lesson became appealing because of the narrative. That lesson was, we were able to sort of memorize or remember this story because of the nature of the narrative. And then we will replicate that story and we'll tell that story to our children, grandchildren, and so on. So storytelling, in a way, is what we do with history, but it's a little bit more than that. Of course, first thing that we do is create knowledge. Every time that we are writing about the past, we are creating knowledge. Remember, history is not set in stone. When we are writing, when we have a question, and we provide an answer to that question in some sort of way, we are creating knowledge or understanding about that past. That knowledge might be limited. Sometimes that knowledge might be like a little bit simplistic or whatever, but it's knowledge. When you put together that essay, when you put together that digital project, I hope that you are thinking of this as, I'm learning, I'm creating knowledge, I'm writing something, and at the same time that I'm writing something, I'm acquiring some knowledge, things that I didn't know before I started this project, right? So writing, if you like, or creating a presentation or whatever it is, that's a form of knowledge creation. In our case, it's historical knowledge creation. But of course, we're not just concerned with the creation of knowledge, we are also concerned with the communication of knowledge. What is the point of knowledge if we just keep it to ourselves, right? It might be historical knowledge, might be scientific knowledge or religious knowledge. The truth is that we think that there is value in knowledge, and that value is maximized when we are able to share it with other people, communicate it, right? One of the things that we know is that some of the technological innovations that are happening in this day and age have sped up because of the communication of knowledge. Before, knowledge was very accessible. You had to go to very specific places to acquire that knowledge. Yeah, we evolved from that, and we created schools. We created schools that became public schools that facilitated that. You know, people put together encyclopedias. Remember? No, you don't remember encyclopedias, right? No. I know that you have gone to the museum and you have seen some encyclopedias. But, all right, you have an encyclopedia at home? Oh, okay. Well, still? No, I don't have one. It's outdated, right? And it's one that you bought, it's one that your parents bought, or one that your grandparents may have bought. It's not one that no, it wasn't. Nobody buys encyclopedias anymore, right? But that was a way of communicating knowledge. So people will buy, the different volumes, because you couldn't buy, different volumes. And they were cherished. They were cherished because this is a family investment. So John, Rose and Peter can go through, the different stages and learn. Our kids, so they can prosper and so on. So it's that the communication of knowledge. Now today, of course, is like we have the information revolution, and that knowledge is just like it's flowing constantly. To the extent that the problem now is not the access to knowledge. The problem is that there's so much knowledge that how can we process it? That's the problem today. Yesterday, the problem was having access to the knowledge. And the people who were knowledgeable, they were very valuable. Oh, he and she, they know this and that. Today, the knowledge, not really that you know things, not that important. That you are able to make sense of this knowledge, that you are able to apply this knowledge is what matters. Because the knowledge is, is all over the place. All you need is some sort of internet connection, some smart device, and you will gain access to that knowledge. But that knowledge, how are you going to process that knowledge? How are you going to apply that knowledge? That's the question. Anyway, so communication of knowledge is essential. And one of the things that we know is that the more we have shared knowledge, the more we have communicated knowledge, the more innovations we had. Because when knowledge was just shared by 1% of the population, it means it's like 1% of minds making use of knowledge. So their ability to innovate was limited to 1%. But when that knowledge is shared by, let's say, 40% of the population, you have 40% of the population with different ideas, right? And they can come up with different solutions and innovations and so on. Anyway, so knowledge creation, knowledge communication that is communicated to a particular audience through a particular medium, right? And then, in doing that, what we do in history? Well, we work with facts and ideas. We tell and we explain. This is what happened. This is why it happened. This is how it happened. These are the consequences of what happened. We tell and that we do, right? That's the sort of historical argument. That is the historical narrative that we're going to tell. That our narrative is going to be a combination of facts and ideas. There's no narrative, historical narrative, if we only have ideas, explanations. No, those explanations need to be rooted or linked to factual information. Equally, there can be a historical narrative if all we have is just data, right? That's more like a bullet point sort of thing. No, that's not a historical narrative. So we create a narrative, and that narrative is usually informed by some sort of historical argument, right? Remember when I told you about your digital project? You need an argument. You're going to tell a story. What is it? What's the story that you want to tell? Yeah, you're going to be talking about the Haitian Revolution. But what about the Haitian Revolution you want to tell to your audience? That will be your historical argument. If you're writing a thesis, that will be your thesis statement. What is the central idea that you want to convey, that you want to get across? The argument is crucial because it's the backbone of your narrative. Without that backbone, without the argument, it's difficult to follow. It's difficult to follow what you're trying to say. It's just like, all right, I see this here, I see this here. It's true, but so what? What are you trying to tell me? What is the point? I went through the entire course. I still don't know what this was all about. There was no historical argument. Yeah, sometimes it happens, right? But if you go through an article, or a reading, and you don't see like, okay, this is a meaning, there's some sort of argument. This is about what, right? We need it. And of course, we also need some sort of fluid organization. We organize our ideas so they can flow. That's essential for the historical narrative. And in history, of course, you need chronology and you need sources. You need chronology. Just don't tell me things are like this. Like, 70% of children have access to primary education. When? In 2019 or in 1962? That's an important thing for a historian. Oh, no, not necessarily for a historian. You do social sciences. It's also important that you will know those sort of things. But the sourcing is also important, right? You provide information. What are your sources? Give me a footnote here and tell me, are you making this up? I know you're not making this up, but I mean, do I have to believe that you actually found this somewhere? Do I have to believe you? Yes, please, sir, believe me. I mean, I found this, but I just can't remember because I didn't take note of where the source was. So now it's difficult for me to put it on there. No, take proper notes and identify the source. And the source is not just the author, the title, the year, it's also the page. I mean, if you provide information about this book, you source in this book, you want me to go through the entire book? No. Tell me it's on page 17, so I can go, oh yeah, it's true. John Smith said that, right? Because I found it in page 17, because otherwise I will have to go through it, and I'm not going to do it, right? And I'm going to tell you, you didn't cite properly. Anyway, so those are some of the central ideas that we are going to discuss. And we're going to do that by looking at the case of Cape Town, South Africa, right? I didn't need to say this, since you already know.
Señor,
Yes.
¿cómo se llama esta unidad?
¿No? Esta unidad se llama unidad Unit 5, right?
El título.
And the title is Historical Narratives.
Oh.
Yeah. All right, so this is what we will examine very shortly next week when we deal with Cape Town. How many of you are familiar with Cape Town? You're familiar with Cape Town? Why?
No, no.
You are not listening.
I just watch it.
Oh, but so you're familiar. How? Oh, the soap operas. Yeah, I tried to watch one the other day, but I did not finish it. Yeah. From Cape history. Okay, apartheid, yes. All right, so Cape Town. Let me tell you something very quickly. I have 1 minute. No, it's actually less, 50 seconds. 50 seconds. South Africa, Cape Town, exceptional case. Europeans never colonized the African continent until the 19th century, until the late 19th century. However, Cape Town, 1652, exceptional. And not just exceptional in terms of the early colonization, we know that it's also exceptional in terms of the things that happen in Cape Town, in and around Cape Town, the entire South Africa, as a matter of fact. In fact, we know that African societies became independent from European rule mostly in the 1960s. South Africa, really, 1990s. Apartheid. I mean, now I'm dealing with students who were not born in 1994. Yeah, nobody's perfect. But, but in 1994, right? In 1994, we see the end of apartheid in South Africa. By then, Jamaica had been an independent country for what, like 60s, 70s, 80s, 30 years. 30 years. And they didn't end this until then. Well, some of it has to do with this exceptional history in terms of what happened in South Africa. And you're going to see some similarities. I'm going to discuss some similarities with the Caribbean experience in terms of the racialization of South Africa, but also some differences. All right? We'll see that next week. All right, I promise we'll see a lot of things next week because we are running out of time. All right, guys, thank you very much. I'll see you later on today, next week, or whenever the case might be. One very quick thing. Those students who are doing the tutorials with me, the essays have to be, once your essays are due, you submit them via our BLE. The students who are doing this with Miss Cornell, you submit a hard copy to her. All right?
Okay.
Because I'm younger, I work with digital. Anyway, for me, just digital, our BLE. For her, analog, old style. All right. Thank you.